All right, so let's talk analysis of your Medusa retelling. So the first thing you read was Patricia Smith's poem Medusa. This is published in 1994, and this is a very different version of the Medusa we get from the original myth. One of the most important revisions in this poem is the revision of Poseidon's rape. In this version, Medusa is not a victim of rape. As a matter of fact, she is the active participant in that encounter with Poseidon. The poem starts off by saying Poseidon was easier than most, meaning not only did she consent and probably pursue Poseidon, but this is not her first encounter, so to speak. So that changes a lot about her story. Medusa as a victim of rape is a pretty foundational part of that mythology, and in the context of Greek myth and women's sexuality tempting men. Even in situations where they're a victim, that is something that we see in classical literature quite a bit. But in a modern context, this revises that, and that does a couple of things. Number one, it gives Medusa agency and power in the situation. Although she may not be as morally upright as the original Medusa, she is able to make decisions, and she is not necessarily a victim, sexually speaking, in Patricia Smith's poem, which is an interesting inversion. It also complicates the idea of a monster. So in the original myth of Medusa, Medusa does nothing. She's a victim of her circumstances and just being beautiful. She's raped by Poseidon and then turned into a monster, and then she goes to the temple and continues worshiping Athena. Arguably, very almost, unattainable level of moral righteousness there, that rather than becoming full of rage and vengeance, she goes off to the temple and worships Athena and sort of minds her own business. And just to point this out, if nobody came to kill her, nobody would die. Everybody that she's turning to stone in the original myth are people who are coming to literally slaughter her. So again, sort of the morally upright version of Medusa, but not Patricia Smith's version. But Patricia Smith's version is probably a lot more relatable or familiar to us in a modern context. She's a lot more casual. She calls Athena a bitch goddess. She seems to be sort of mocking Poseidon. She says it was just a lay and not a particularly good one at that. So what do we know about Medusa in this poem? She is sexually active. She doesn't feel bad about it. She doesn't have an emotional connection to it. She just had a meaningless encounter with Poseidon, and that's that. And this is what becomes, the cause of her punishment. Now, this is made perhaps, she's not a victim in this situation. So, does she embody a monster in this poem? Now, arguably, this is the version of Medusa that pop culture has represented for a long time. This idea of a temptress or seductress. And we know that that's not true to the original myth, but arguably this is the version of Medusa that pop culture would have you believe is true. However, is she a monster in this version? I can't answer that for you, but some ideas to think about as we're looking at this in a modern context. What is Medusa guilty of in this poem? Having sex and liking it, basically. That is all that she really seems to be guilty of, or using her sexuality for her own satisfaction, without care or cause or emotional connection. And in a modern retelling, this is, of course, connected to our conversations about sexuality and about femininity. In 1994, when this was published, the idea of sort of villainizing or creating a monster out of a woman who, behaved in this way was very much part of the cultural conversation. And Medusa, in this case, is villainized because she just had casual sex and didn't feel bad about it, right? So the conclusions that we can draw thematically from that in the contemporary relevance are certainly something to be thinking about. And I think that, I think it's a reasonable reaction to say that this Medusa is perhaps more monstrous than the original myth's Medusa. But then, of course, the commentary there to consider is, well, what makes her monstrous? Is it sort of asking us to question whether promiscuity or, empowered sexuality or whatever, agency she has in her, sex life, is the poem asking us to question whether culture or society makes monsters out of that? I don't know. That's something to consider. So in Karina Bissette's retelling of the Medusa story, it starts off with this epigraph that the title comes from G.K. Chesterton. And then we have a separate paragraph that's separated with a line of asterisks. So that tells us that this is meant to be read as a sort of preface or prologue outside of the narrative timeline. That paragraph is, ancient stories describe the fates of unfortunate souls who have suffered from the terrible curse of beauty. Men loved by the gods turn to flowers, the short-lived anemone, the white narcissus, the tear-stained hyacinth. But those of the fairer sex, meaning women, rarely survived such attacks. Instead, their youth was stripped like leaves from a bough, their bones hollowed into flutes, their faces smoothed into paper masks. Those were the lucky ones. So tons of mythological allusion there. The anemone is a reference to Adonis, who was turned into an anemone after his death. Narcissus is a reference to Narcissus, who's turned into a flower after his death. And the hyacinth is a reference to Hyacinthus, who was also turned into a hyacinth after his death. And these are all very beautiful men from Greek mythology that after their death, and their death was considered a great tragedy, were turned into flowers of some kind. And she compares this to women who their bones hollowed into flutes, which is likely a reference to Pan and Syrinx. Syrinx was turned into reeds that were then made into flutes. She was a nymph. Beautiful. That's what nymphs are. We talked about that with Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? And their faces smoothed into paper masks. And those were the lucky ones. So from the very beginning, Bissette is setting up what the story is thematically centered around. Centered around the idea of the terrible curse of beauty and the different fates that befall men and women mythologically and, of course, interpretively in a cultural, contemporary, thematic way. Now, in terms of the myth's timeline itself, this story does, unlike Smith, it does keep the rape by Poseidon within the myth, and it doesn't, it doesn't hold back in its description. It discusses her being broken and bloody, and locked by a tangled chain and a trident to the temple wall. It really does sort of, perhaps more so than the other versions, expose the brutality of that incident. But you note that it doesn't actually, this story, in terms of character, doesn't name any of the figures outside of Medusa, who's referred to as M. But all of the other characters in the story, Poseidon, Athena, and Perseus, are not named. So Poseidon is just the sea king. And then Athena is referred to in two different ways, the virgin goddess of wisdom and the virgin goddess of truth and justice, which both of those things are, of course, ironic in that she is not acting with wisdom or truth or justice in what she does to Medusa. And then Perseus is just the hero. Now, as soon as the incident occurs, Athena immediately blames Medusa for it. And Medusa knows this before it's even over. She says she will never forgive me. And Athena says, I heard you seducing him. I've seen the way you walk, the way you tempt him. You defiled my temple with your unholy lust. So, what we would call this in modern context is victim blaming. I mean, this is a fictional or mythological version of the, well, what was she wearing narrative that is part of, our cultural conversation about assault and victimization. And this, of course, has thematic implications in that modern context. And you have this very interesting internal monologue. These are the portions of the story in italics. So these are not things spoken out loud, but things that Medusa is thinking internally. She says, "Did you hear my screams? Where were you?" And these, of course, are in stark contrast to the things that, she speaks out loud. Give me courage, give me strength, give me justice. And then in her internal monologue, save me. Sort of begging for Athena to recognize the brutality of what's happened to her, only to be let down, as we know from the myth. Now, once she is turned into the Gorgon, an interesting deviation here is that the snakes are not just like her hair. Like, they urge her to do things, they encourage her to do things, and they seem to be pushing her to rage and vengeance. And as I mentioned in Smith's analysis, I don't think that that's a particularly difficult to relate to reaction to this. She has every reason to be righteously pissed and sort of embody that monstrosity. This is, if there's a villain origin story, I think Medusa has a pretty solid reason to become the villain. But unlike the original myth, where Medusa goes and worships Athena and stays in her temple, this Bissette's version of Medusa does assume the monster role and takes ownership of it. It says that she spends hours each day polishing their petrified remains. So she, in response to this, does become the villain. Admittedly not because of anything that she actually did, but what else is there for her to do other than to become the villain? And in terms of contemporary relevance, again, I think this is a more familiar or relatable reaction than perhaps the virtuous, original myth. Now, enter the hero. Perseus is referred to as the hero, and this is our unit on heroes and monsters, right? So what is his role in the story? He is here to kill her. And as she has assumed the role of a monster, what is her role in the story? Her purpose in the hero story is to die. The only thing that the monster exists for is as a trial for the hero to overcome. And so when she encounters the hero, another revision that this myth makes is that we learn that they had a relationship when they were young, and that they loved each other. And this, of course, complicates the hero and the myth dynamic, or the hero and the monster dynamic. But heroes and monsters are, intrinsically linked in mythology. They exist together. And this is an interesting sort of inversion of that, this sort of affectionate relationship between the two who are doomed to destroy each other, one or the other. Now, as the hero enters, he sort of hesitates to carry out his duty and slay the monster. But it's Medusa who says, pick up your sword and slay the monster. Urging the hero to allow her to fulfill her purpose. Which, if you think about it, there's really nothing else for her to do from a story perspective other than to die. And if anything, this experience with the hero just amplifies what her punishment really is, which is she'll never be able to experience love or companionship or a relationship or anything like that. And what is her only crime? Being beautiful. And ultimately, the hero does fulfill his purpose. He does slay the monster. His last words to her are, "You are so beautiful. I love you. I have always loved you." And he slays her anyway. It says his sword is swift and sure, and she leaps out of her human body into her new form. So this is another revision where instead of Medusa giving birth to the Pegasus, she becomes the Pegasus. And this is a trope throughout the story. Discusses her invisible wings that are ensnared by a golden net. And then as she is slayed, she is set free from this in the form of a Pegasus. It mentions hooves in the last paragraph. However, that last paragraph is very interesting in that context of that first paragraph. She says, "I am more beautiful than ever with my white coat and golden wings, but this time I am untouchable. In a sweeping circle I make a pass over the wild cliffside garden and its stone sentinels. The hero stands at the cave mouth. A bloody bag hangs from his belt." That's her head. "But his shield and sword are lowered. I can feel him urging me to return to offer myself to him. But can he see I am no longer a woman dreaming of love lost, nor am I a monster seeking revenge. I am finally free." So these wings and this flight, of course, is conventionally symbolic of freedom. But what is she freed from? Her mortal life? Well, yes, but note, she is still able to tell her story after her death. So she's not really dead, is she? What's actually happened to her is she's freed from being in the body of a woman. She has now become the Pegasus, and she is no longer trapped by, the things that befell her because of no fault of her own. And so in terms of in a modern context, the story is of course making a commentary on victim blaming and our cultural conversations about rape and sexual assault. But it's also making a commentary on existing as a woman, particularly an attractive woman, who, the experiences that might befall women who are in that position. Story tells us from the very beginning, men who are loved by the gods are turned into flowers, and women, if they're lucky, are killed. But they befall much worse fates in many cases, and that's certainly the case with Medusa. And so her act of freedom, or her redemption at the end of the story, is to be slayed. It's not a tragic thing that she is slayed as the monster, because she is finally freed from what she was trapped by in her human form.